Yeah, so this is arguably maybe one of the longest titles you ever saw, but it really is what I want to talk about. Really, moving your phone numbers to Teams, and then in such a way that you don't have to worry about any infrastructure, like setting up SBCs, configuring really difficult installations. Um, like it can be really simple. That's what I'm just saying. And I'll cover like what are all the options, what are the pros and the cons, and then potentially it's up to you to decide what is the best type of deployment for you. So my name is Johan Delimon. I work at Collective Consulting. I'm the CEO. I'm an MVP for 12, 13 years, I forgot. I'm also an MCT for almost 10 years. And you can find my details on this slide, but I'm not going to cover it again because it's a really, really short session and I want to go through all my slides. But you'll have it in the slides afterwards. So calling for the cloud. So if we have Microsoft Teams and we want to add calling to Teams, because many installations that I see with customers have just Teams for meetings and do collaborative functions like Teams and channels and working together on documents. And of course, do chat, meetings, and one-to-one calling. But of course, most companies do want to migrate their phone system to Microsoft Teams as well. So what do you need in order for getting your PBX into Teams? So first of all, of course, we need Teams, and it's the modern workplace for Office 365. But then we need to add a PBX component, which is going to be phone system. Now, phone system is not a software you install on your client because it's included in a Teams client. It's essentially a license that you apply to your account. And of course, the phone system makes sure that we can interconnect all of those phone numbers to those users. Now, there are two different ways of doing this. So first of all, there's calling plans from Microsoft, which means we have PSTN numbers from Microsoft, we pay Microsoft, and we configure everything through the admin portal. So it's pretty simple, but it may not be the most flexible solution, or I would say the most or the least expensive solution. It kind of depends how you look at or how many calls that you make and how many calls that your users make internationally versus locally. And then the second option that we have is direct routing in Teams, which gives you a whole lot of flexibility. Either you do it yourself or you actually buy direct routing from other providers. So I'm going to cover that as well. So it looks like you only have two options, but in reality, it's much more than that. Because the other options are also based on direct routing components, but it works in a little bit of different way, and I'll dive into that as well. So let's look at calling plans, because that's the way we want to implement phone system with Microsoft, and only Microsoft. We're not going to configure any direct routing, at least you don't have to, right? Calling plans are available not worldwide. There's a limited set of countries where we can use calling plans. So they are all listed below here in the blue dot is Microsoft, natively available from Microsoft, or in those red places, those are third-party calling plans. Now the reds on the map are new ones, available like a few weeks ago. So Microsoft is constantly adding new countries. Now you see most of the European countries already have the calling plans available. We have US, Puerto Rico, and Canada, and then Asian Pacific, we now have New Zealand and Singapore as well, next to Australia and Japan for third-party calling plans. Now, these calling plans are really simple, right? It's a license, you apply it to a user. When you apply it to a user, you can you can request phone numbers from Microsoft, or you can port your existing numbers from your existing provider to Microsoft. So At that point, your phone numbers are available in the admin center, and you can apply those phone numbers really easily to users by the admin center or with PowerShell. You have two options here for calling plans. It's local calling, like national calling, or international calling plans. There's small domestic calling plans, there's the regular domestic calling plan, and there's the domestic and international calling plan. They all have different rates, of course. So for the domestic and international calling plan, you pay around $24 per month per user. Goes down to $6 for the small domestic calling plan. So this is the smallest plan you can buy. But I still have a lot of customers where this is still more expensive than their current spending on the PBX. But the calling plans are really simple. You don't have to be an expert. So rapid provisioning, the porting is pretty easy, I would say, and it usually goes well. Sometimes it can buckle up, but this is what we have, calling plans. And I'm highlighting the countries again because it was pretty small. So we had the first column, we had them available for, I would say, some years, and they were there for a longer time. But then last year, we added Austria, Denmark, Italy, Portugal, Sweden, and Switzerland. And then a few weeks ago, we added New Zealand, Singapore, Romania, Czech Republic, Hungary, Finland, Norway, and Slovakia. So you see, Microsoft is constantly adding new countries. So how does that look like from an infrastructure point of view? Because I was talking about my title is very long, and you bring your phone numbers to Microsoft without any infrastructure needed. So in this case, we do have a legacy PBX, but we want to migrate to Microsoft Calling Plan in this case, right? So it is Microsoft who is providing an SBC, which is an infrastructure piece. It has a SIP trunk to the PSTN network, like the public PSTN services, the public network where we can call all the numbers. And then we have phone numbers that come into play here, and we have calling minutes. So all of these pieces are managed by Microsoft. You just pay a license, and Microsoft manages all of this infrastructure for you, right? At this point, the Teams users just log on to Teams and can just start using those numbers hosted on Microsoft with those calling plans. So essentially, you don't need anything on your customer network, anything at all. Of course, if you still have a legacy PBX and you want to migrate, essentially you have to port over those numbers to Microsoft. There's no way we can do real intro between the legacy PBX or Microsoft. No, it's one way or the other. Potentially you can port number ranges and have some people still be on the legacy PBX while others move to Teams, but this is not really flexible. And most providers don't really like that. So if you look at the pros and the cons, like you don't really need any infrastructure. It's a really simple deployment, and you quickly activate numbers for users. The cons, while you do need extra licenses, well, you're going to pay a little bit more. Well, there's a typo on the slide. It is available in 26 countries now, but it's not available worldwide. So if you want to deploy worldwide, you're a big company and you have offices all over the world, then potentially you have to add some other options as well. Like I said, generally calling plans are more expensive than normal carrier contracts where you pay per minute. So if someone does a phone call, usually it's pay per minute per user. And of course, we don't have integration with PBX. So luckily, Microsoft came out with direct routing for Teams, where we have a session border controller, which is in between potentially your existing SIP trunk and Microsoft Teams, or your PBX and Microsoft Teams. So it makes it possible for you to route calls between different systems, and you can connect it to Microsoft Teams. So it means essentially you can have your PBX that's connected to your carrier. You can take over that connection to the carrier and configure it on the SBC and make it available on Teams. So there are different methods of doing direct routing, right? So first of all, there's the customer hosted, which means you all can do it yourself, right? It involves a little bit more effort and you will have to know what you're doing. But this is still an option, right? So you can do direct routing. But then in that case, if you do it yourself, of course, you have to host an SBC, you have to do the SIP trunking configuration, your phone numbers will be hosted on this trunk, and calling minutes will need to be paid to your provider. Of course, we need to hook up this session border controller to Teams, and whenever we do this, it can be hooked up at the same time to the legacy PBX as well, so you have intro between the legacy PBX and Teams. So in this case, we can move one user at a time from the legacy PBX to Teams and still have intro between those systems. Now, of course, my title says you don't want any infrastructure. In this case, you do have infrastructure because you have the SBC and all of these configurations. So looking at the pros and the cons, while direct routing is available worldwide, well, and we can have interop with PBX. You can use your existing carrier contracts and your existing numbers really easy, but you have to buy a new SBC or potentially reconfigure the SBC. You have to manage it all yourself. And typically, if you want to deploy an SBC, that's going to be a project because it needs to be somewhere connected to the internet, and then the networking teams will be looking at you and saying, well, security is important here, so we probably have a proper design, and it's probably going to take a while before this gets into production. So it's not really fast to deploy. So this is a similar model, while we can also do direct routing, still owned by the customers themselves, but in this time it's in Azure. Now all the bits and pieces are still the same because you still own the SBC, which is in Azure. It's running on a VM that you own in Azure. You connect it to the SIP trunks, you connect it to Teams, you still have the phone numbers and the calling minutes. And potentially you can have PBX interop if you want to, but essentially this is kind of more or less the same thing as we saw before. So the pros and the cons will be more or less the same. Well, the only additional difference here is that we have an excellent network between the SBC and the Teams service because Azure and the Teams service is essentially in the same location. But now you need to manage the virtual SBC. You still need to manage SIP trunks. You still need to have a project going on because it still involves security. But it's going to be probably a little bit faster than doing it all yourself in the on-prem environment. Now, this is another model which is based on carriers. So instead of you doing this as a customer, the carrier or your provider where you're going to buy your numbers and calling plans can host everything for you. So the SBC in this case is going to be hosted in the carrier network. And so the carrier hosts the SBC, SIP trunk. Of course, you own the phone numbers and you have to pay the calling numbers to this service provider. But we also hook this session border controller up to Microsoft Teams. So in essence, if you look at this environment, you're still not adding any infrastructure. All the infrastructure is hosted at the carrier side. So you don't really have to worry about installing, managing, and setting up this SBC and all of that comes with it. Of course, potentially you do have to manage the Teams side of it because this connection needs to be set up, but that's, I would say, pretty simple. It's not really simple, but Microsoft is still working on another solution there, which I will mention a little bit. So in this case, we can have the Teams users use the carrier SBC for calling to international or national numbers. I haven't really seen this in practice, but potentially the carrier can allow you to connect to legacy PBXs, but I think those chances are very low, unless it's dedicated SBC that you pay for anyway. Now, the pros are it's available worldwide as well. It kind of depends on what carrier that you have, because not all carriers are in all countries. So maybe you will need multiple carriers there. And you're going to pay just by the minutes. Like you're consuming minutes, and most likely you're just paying minutes to your provider. It's really simple to deploy on Teams, but of course you can combine multiple carriers, so it's not too big of an issue. You can have multiple carriers, so covering multiple countries that may not be available with certain carriers. So how it actually works, the carrier-hosted model is they're not going to deploy SBCs for every single customer. Now, they are going to reuse this SBC for multiple customers because that really makes sense. And essentially, that's what they have been doing for so long. They're providing SIP trunks. This SIP trunk is usually also hosted on SBC, which is also used by multiple customers. So essentially how they have to set it up, and it's not too important to remember all of this, but there's a way to set up the SBC and share the same SBC between customers. Like you see, this is SBC1 for customers, this is SBC2 for a different customer, and SBC3 for a different customer. So that's all possible. So, but how do you go forward with this? Of course, you have to choose your carrier, prepare your deployment, and then configure the users. So choose your carrier, and this is a tricky point, right? Because your existing carrier may not have this capability yet, or they are still working on this capability. And then, of course, your carrier may not be available in all countries. So maybe you need multiple countries. So you do have to think about what countries is my business in, and what carrier does cover all of those countries. So potentially you may need to port your numbers to another carrier if you want to use this model. So when we select a carrier, then we do have to do some additional steps to connect this carrier to Teams. And I'll show you what you have to do. So essentially, what you have to do is create a gateway that connects to the carrier. We have to configure a user with a specific I would say SIP address, because it needs to be enabled with the right domain. And then we apply the license to this dummy user, because this process of deploying direct routing requires you to add certain domains, and it's a funky thing, but you do need to have a dummy user that has a specific license with the right domain configured. And then, of course, we're going to add the PSTN gateway, configure dial plans, routing policies, and apply those policies to users. But this is something that you have to do for almost all of the voice configurations, except the first part, which may already be done. For example, for Microsoft, you don't really need to do this. But if you deploy direct routing, you're most likely going to add PSTN gateways. Now, there are different models available, and this first step is not always required, and you'll see that it's going to be easier and easier in the future. So just let me walk you through what you have to do. Like if you go for a carrier model, which is using this specific configuration, in this case, you have to add like your customer number 1, for example. So it says SBC customers, SBC1 customers 88.biz is the SBC that we're going to use at the carrier side. So, but in order for you to create those PSTN gateways, we need to have this domain configured in our tenant. So we need to add it to the tenant first. So this is the steps you need to do. So it's SBC1 customers 88.biz. You add this domain, you do the verification, and you don't have to enable it for any services. And you click finish. Like it says setup complete. The second step is we need to create a test user, a dummy user for activating this subdomain. So it's a test user which has SBC1 customers 88.biz as the domain. So the UPN is this value, right? This is really important. Otherwise, it's not going to be recognized by Skype for Business and Teams. so you cannot create those PSTN gateways. Now we also need to apply a license, and this is temporary because you can remove it later, but we do need to be this user account to have a Teams enabled, and it also needs to be Skype for Business enabled in order for this to work. So once we all have done this, then it's pretty simple. It's just a few PowerShell commands. So we may or may not have to do this one because I have other options I will show, which Microsoft has been working on. But essentially, this is what you do if you host it yourself. And in some carrier models, you also have to do this. But then you say, okay, we have an online PSTN usage, which means these users are going to call unrestricted. So they can call every number and they don't have any restrictions. This is just an example, right? Because you don't want all your users to be configured like this. So you can create multiple PSTN usages. So one that has restrictions, right? But this is just an example. So and then we say this, we have a voice route, and all the users that have PSTN uses unrestricted, when we apply this voice route to a user, it will be able to call unrestricted because it's defined as unrestricted. Oh, that's the voice route. I'm sorry. This is the voice route, which means the infrastructure where we're going to connect to the SBC, and this is the policy we're going to apply to a user. So this is the name of the policy, but it's going to use the online PSTN usage, which we created here. And the route is going to tie into the PSTN usage as well. So it has unrestricted, unrestricted. So we're using this one to glue the routes together with the policy. So all the users that will be getting this policy OVRP unrestricted will be able to call this route. And then we do have to apply these policies to the user just by using grants as online voice routing policy, just like you apply any other policy. And then, well, it's important to have a Teams user, right? Because direct routing is only supported by Teams users, not supported by Skype for Business Online. So if it's in island mode, it won't work. So you have to apply it to upgrade to Teams only. And then last step is that we have to configure a phone number. We have to set the on-prem line URI. Like in this case, +32 is a Belgian number, and we say enterprise voice enabled true and hosted voicemail true. Of course, this user also needs a phone system license. That's at least what this user needs. And then if you look at the admin center, we can actually see those two SBCs. In this case, it's from the same carrier for failover routing. So both of these SBCs can be used. And you see they're active. There are not so many calls because this is a test, essentially. But you can look at the details here. When you click on this SBC, you can see how many calls were there the last 7 days or 60 days. And did it all work, right? We also have network parameters. So how many calls did we have? What was the jitter, packet loss, and latency? So they all have to apply to certain values because we want to have high quality calls. And then what was the effectiveness, and then average call duration. You can get some metrics here. What's also new is that you have PSTN reports available for direct routing. So you can see what user has been calling what phone numbers. Of course, they are kind of masked, so GDPR proof, I would say. So they are available as well. And then if you want to do some troubleshooting, in this same PSTN report, you see, for example, some final zip codes for calls that may not have set up correctly, and maybe we have to find out what was the reason why this call didn't go through. So those are all available. And now this is something new I want to mention really quickly here. Microsoft is working on Operator Connect for Microsoft Teams. So all the difficult work that you have to do for adding direct routing for carriers, will be integrated into the admin center. So essentially you will be selecting a carrier and everything will be done for you in the background. So you see there are already multiple carriers working on certifying for this new Operator Connect piece. I haven't really seen it in action yet because they just released it or announced it at Ignite this year. So but it does allow you to bring your own telco operator because they are going to be listed in the admin center. It's really simple for provisioning and management because all the phone numbers and all the actions will be in the admin center and many things will be done for you. And it will be similar to how Microsoft calling plans work because your phone numbers will be available from the admin center and you will be able to apply them to users. So I do have a small video because for those that haven't seen Ignite.
So we start here in the Teams Admin Center on this Operator tab, where you see all of the operators that are part of the Operator Connect program. And this list will evolve as more partners are added to the program. I can filter on certain parameters, for example, those that serve the United States and offer a calling solution, to show only the ones that meet my requirements. In this case, Contoso Telecom. Then to confirm the connection to my tenant, I simply choose the locations I'm interested in. I can allow the operator to contact me, and then accept the data transfer notice that will be presented. Click Add, and I'm connected. Now going back to my Operator tab, I can see that Contoso Telecom has been added to my list. But what really matters is that this allows my operator to upload numbers to my tenants, which I can visualize and manage directly from the phone number page, literally having enabled calling from my users in a matter of minutes. Operator Connect will soon be available for our initial wave of operator partners, and we will add additional partners to the program over time. To learn more,
okay, so that was a short video
of your operators participating.
What that means. So I'm eagerly waiting whenever that comes available. So, but to round it up a little bit, we have direct routing for carriers. We have essentially 3 flavors where in the first 2 cases, you have to do manual work. You have to configure domains. You have to configure users and license this dummy user, right? You have to create a PSTN gateway. And if it's available in the admin center, and if you can read the SBC statistics. So in the original model, you have to do a lot of manual work. It's not embedded in the admin center, but you can see the SBC statistics. There has been a new model as well, which is calling derived trunk, which also called super trunk. In this case, you didn't have to create a PSTN gateway, so it's just 1 step less. But the downside to this model is that you don't see the SBC statistics, which I kind of like to see, because if something's going on, I want to know about that. And then we have the Operator Connect model, which, well, I think there's still a typo here. You don't have to create a PSTN gateway. You don't have to do manual work. You don't have to configure domains or dummy users, but it is embedded in the admin center, which makes it really easy for users to configure this. But we also do not have the SBC statistics. So that's for the future. Not sure when this is going to be available. So to round up, so if you want to deploy Teams voice globally without any infrastructure, you have 2 options. And those options are not mutually exclusive because you can combine them, right? You can go with Microsoft calling plans, or you can go with direct routing for carriers, which is going to evolve in Operator Connect. Or you can combine those 2. Like in some countries, you're going to do calling plans for Microsoft, and in some countries, maybe we'll have to do direct routing for carriers. And you can match and choose whatever you want. You can even have calling plans for a user for example, domestic calling, and have direct routing for carriers for international calls on the same user. So it's pretty flexible, and you can combine this and whatever you want, what best fits for your organization. So that concludes my session.